Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
It's called The Biggest Little Farm, Saving Emma the Pig. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. It's actually a children's book by John Chester and illustrated by Jennifer Meyer. And the account is drawn from Chester's Apricot Lane Farms located in Ventura, California. The story of Saving Emma is an example of the kind of farming that Chester and his wife Molly do with their team to grow crops and raise animals in a way that is more in tune with nature. He'll be holding a book signing event at the Greyhound Bookstore in Berlin. And we have him on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Hey, good morning.
So tell me then, well, let's first of all start with Emma. How did you get her, and what is her story? Tell me a little bit about how all that played out.
Well, when my wife and I decided to build essentially a farm in the image of an ecosystem, we needed an animal essentially representing every possible environmentally regenerative factor, and pigs are really good at turning soil. So we got ourselves a pig. It was probably about a 300-pound red wattle named Emma, and little did we know she was incredibly pregnant, more pregnant than we had imagined, twice as pregnant as most pigs are, let's just say.
So what was her condition, and what was the kind of thing you had to deal with in terms of getting her to good health?
Well, when she started having babies, we thought, okay, maybe 6 or 8, just based on her size, but she ended up having 17 piglets, and it was just nonstop. I was worried. I didn't think it was going to ever end. And shortly after she had all those babies, she fell really sick. And again, we're new farmers, so this is all very new for us. And really the story sort of follows the process of, what we had to figure out in order to get, Emma going again so that she could also raise the 17 piglets she had just birthed.
Now, I understand you tried a lot of things, but the piglets were sort of the answer in the end.
She wouldn't eat, and we couldn't figure out how to get her to eat, but we had taken her piglets away in order to help her get better. And we just said, well, you know what, nothing's working. We should at least just bring the piglets back in just to maybe say goodbye. And when we did, she jumped right up and started eating and started letting her piglets nurse.
So what made you decide to get into farming like this? I mean, I understand that you didn't really have a lot of farming experience.
Both Molly and I mean, it's really covered in the film The Biggest Little Farm, which is actually playing on the Eastern Shore starting the 20th at the flagship cinema down there in West Ocean City. The Biggest Little Farm sort of follows our story of 8 years of taking a conventionally run farm and turning it into a regenerative farm, one that essentially reinvigorates an ecosystem and then tries to incorporate a farm within it. So we utilize plants, animals, and various wildlife habitat strategies to mitigate the farm against epidemics of pests and disease so that we're not reliant or ever using chemically derived solutions. So it's essentially farming within an ecosystem.
So what motivated you to get into farming?
Well, Molly was a traditional foods chef, so she was specializing in, preparing foods in ways that our ancestors would cook in order to maximize health and digestion. And the more we got into that, we realized it really all starts with the farmer and the soil and how the soil is being maintained. And so really this whole idea of regenerative farming is about making the soil incredibly healthy so that it's able to maximize the nutrient density of the food that's grown there. And at the same time, it's, as a sort of a side effect of farming in this way, it's actually ecologically enhancing an environment. So it's repairing and regenerating land that normally, in the way that we farm sort of as an industrialized monocrop type system, is all about extraction. So it's the opposite of extraction, it's regeneration. So not only do you get this great tasting food that's super nutrient dense, but you get this incredible restorative ecological effect from a regenerative farming method.
So what were those early days then like? I mean, what kinds of things did you have to learn?
Well, I think what we had to learn is that, this idea of bringing nature back to the farm was incredibly idealistic, of course, and we had to learn that there was going to be a harmony found through accepting a comfortable level of disharmony. But the deeper we would go into problems and not try to sort of turn around and fix them with the quick, simple, synthetically derived chemical solution, the more we allow those things to express themselves, the more likelihood we would find an intersection in nature where another thing could come in and start to solve it. Like, so for example, we created cover crop in order to rebuild soils, and we created one of the worst gopher problems by growing cover crop. Most people don't grow grasses under their orchards in Southern California. They kill all the grasses. Well, we did that to build and enhance soil, but gophers love cover crop. And then at the same time, we were putting owl boxes up all over the farm. And then by the 5th year, we had about 87 barn owls in 1 year come through and wipe out about 20,000 gophers. So you start to find these ways within nature that already exist, where you can find comfortable levels of disharmony, but it allows for essentially the rebuilding of a very healthy immune system. Because you need diversity. It's all about biological diversity and the regeneration of healthy topsoil. That's sort of the basis for the immune system of a farm, but it involves bringing nature back to the farm and understanding the roles and purpose between the predator and prey relationships that have existed for, upwards of billions of years.
You use a term, actually, which is biomimicry, sort of emulating, I guess, is nature's pattern. What do you mean by that, and how practical is that once you get beyond, your own farm?
It's incredibly practical if we think in terms of the extractive methods that we use to farm today have evolved over the last 75, years, especially since we started using chemicals. And the problem is that the extractive methods are destroying finite resources that we need to grow food for future generations. So if you can begin to understand the importance of that statement, you then want to go deeper into how we can sort of figure out ways to not be extractive and be regenerative. And so it does require things like understanding biomimicry, understanding mutualistic relationships, beneficial relationships in nature, so that you're enhancing at the same time that you are pulling from nature what you need. Because ultimately we're talking about these finite, non-renewable resources that we need in soil in order to grow healthy food.
So tell me then a little bit about what you do with the soil. I mean, you talk about, I guess, compost teas, some diverse, obviously, cover crops and so on, using good bacteria. What does all that mean, particularly here on the shore when we have a lot of farming here?
Yeah, I mean, essentially the soil biota is made up of microorganisms, fungi and bacteria, all these different sort of microorganisms coming together to ultimately do the work of breaking down decaying plant and animal matter and turning it back into nutrients that feed future life, right? So you want to create this sort of cocktail of microorganisms that exist in a healthy way within your soil, and then that allows all the decaying things on top to be turned back in and reused by the plants growing in the same medium. And it also infuses the right amount of energy in for microorganisms to break down the minerals in plants to allow the plant root systems to then be able to use that and put that into the food that it's growing. So our goal as a farm is to keep the carbon sugars, the photosynthesis process above that soil, pumping away and feeding those microorganisms to give them the energy that they need to continue this process. And so that's all we think about every single day, and that includes thinking about how many animals can we have on one healthy acre of land before it becomes unhealthy and it starts to destroy or take away from that process. Ruminants like cows and sheep utilize microorganisms in their rumen in order to break down the grass. And essentially what they're trying to do is break down that grass, and the life force for the cow is a volatile fatty acid, right? But when the cow poops, out the backside comes some of those extra bacteria. And those same bacteria go to work in the soil and do the same thing, constantly breaking down decaying plant and animal life. So we're looking to infuse animals back onto the land in order to build and add to the diversity of healthy soil. And we do the same thing with like the worm bin. We call it the Vermicompost Center, where we have a couple 100,000 red wiggler worms breaking down old produce, old manure even, old wood chips. And the worm itself can inoculate soil with up to 48 different types of bacteria. The worm casting, which is the worm poop, is an incredibly invaluable and potent ingredient in soil health. And so we capture those worm castings and we make compost teas out of them. And that then sort of proliferates the microorganism count, and then we inject that into our irrigation system. It goes back out onto the soil, infusing the soil with more diversity of microorganisms in order to help that process continue. It's all about diversity. You want the good and the bad players out there, and they sort of equalize themselves. They don't let epidemics run one way or another. And you want that balance of diversity. So our job is to figure out what animals exist in nature that help build soil, that have so over millions of years, and bring them back to the farm to help us do the thing that we've tried to do chemically and never been able to do well as humans. And so I think what you're seeing is this incredible awareness for the tools that we've always needed have been right in front of us. We just didn't understand. We lost the lore and the connection to how to bring all these things together in order to rebuild healthy ecosystems that we can farm within.
By the way, what is a compost tea brewer?
So a compost tea brewer, man, you're asking really detailed questions. This is great. A compost tea brewer essentially takes the worm castings that we've scraped from the bottom of a worm bin and adds an aerated environment to it, so that we get not the anaerobic bacteria, but the aerobic bacteria. And it brews for 24 hours with just nothing more than bubbles, water, and those castings. And you add a little bit of like a ground-up pumpkin or a ground-up goji berry type sugary starter, and that creates this proliferation and multiplication of the bacteria colonies in that tea. And we brew them about 500 gallons a batch. And then we do basically a slow, like almost homeopathic level of drip into the irrigation line. So just a little bit over the period of a few hours, and that goes into the irrigation system, essentially spreading those bacteria and other microorganisms all throughout the farm, inoculating that soil, and adding to the diversity of what ultimately makes up that healthy soil biota.
Now, for the animals, you talk about managed intensive grazing, allowing the animals to roam. Tell me a little bit about that and the idea that you tend to rotate them.
So, we're essentially doing that biomimicry thing where, the buffalo used to move in, groups of, they say, up to 1 million at a time, right, across these giant prairies. They would be closely stacked together, and they were constantly in fear of predation, being killed. And so they were tightly packed and moving constantly, never sort of sitting in one spot. So it would be nibble, nibble, move, nibble, nibble, move. They'd probably eat, let's say, 30%, trample 30%, and leave about 30% of the grass uneaten. And then behind, there'd be all these, these buffalo pies. And then the flies would come in and start laying their eggs in these buffalo patties. And, so what you had was this incredibly healthy landscape that then would explode with flies. But what was happening is then it would be followed by, the wild chickens or turkeys at the time. I don't really know what they were called back then, but they would follow behind, and they would actually eat the larvae out of the cow pies or buffalo pies before they could eventually mature. And so what we're doing is we're recreating the same system with a sort of a planned grazing operation where we put the cows tightly packed on an acre of land for maybe a couple of hours or a day at the most, and then move them very quickly. So it forces them to eat quick, but not everything, and trample more than they can eat, so it helps to regenerate that landscape. And then we bring in chickens, and then the chickens go through and they break up all the cow pies, and scatter the manure around, which reduces the parasite load on that pasture, because parasites can't live in a really dry environment. So when you scatter that manure around, it dries out that parasite, preventing it from being an egg to be re-ingested by an animal coming along later. And the whole process is essentially mimicking what was happening on those, with the buffalo migrations.
Now, you also talk about a pond and pulling nitrogen and phosphorus out from the water. I mean, you're coming particularly from the Eastern Shore. You know that nitrogen and phosphorus are a big thing here on the shore. We have a phosphorus management plan that's supposed to be taking effect. We talk a lot about that, particularly as it seeps into the Chesapeake Bay. Tell me a little bit about your efforts to get some of that stuff out of the water.
Cover crops obviously build soil, but they also prevent water from running off. And they create soil porosity and allows water to be absorbed into the soil. And I remember growing up on the Eastern Shore, there's not a lot of cover crops being grown. There's a lot of soy and corn being grown, and then there's these fields that sit fallow with massive rains that come along and then wash away all that topsoil and those nutrients, into the waters, or, the estuaries in the bay. So I think, that's something that we obviously have prevented through the growing of cover crops. And then we also use, like in our pond, we use these floating islands that the roots of those plants that are on these little floating islands, they're like these little sponge islands, are actually sucking the nitrogen and excess phosphorus out of the water of the pond, which helps to offset all the excess nutrients that are, placed there essentially by migrating birds. And I've actually heard of some of this stuff, especially like even the floating islands, being tried in certain areas of the Eastern Shore. I'm not familiar around the specifics, but we're talking about nutrient runoff from agriculture that's causing all these massive, acidification, eutrophication of the Chesapeake Bay.
So you also, of course, raise chickens, and poultry is a big thing here on the Eastern Shore. How do you raise them? And I guess they roam free, and I guess they're soy free as well. Tell me a little bit about how that came about. Yeah,
so in order to have healthy land, when you're running 35 cows through a pasture, you need chickens to go in there and break up those manure piles and eat the fly larvae out of it. And so we started raising chickens really as a process to help offset, the effects of running cows through the pastures. And what you get are amazing tasting eggs.
In terms of being soy-free, how important is that?
There's some science out there that disputes it and also supports it. So the idea is that we don't feed any soy to any of our chickens. So they get a soy-free ration, a GMO-free organic ration that supplements what they're eating off the pastures, including the bugs, worms, and grasses that they eat. It ends up being about 50% of their diet. But we don't feed them any soy product because there are some people that are have allergies to soy, and there's some belief that some of that can be passed on through the egg. Although, again, I've read science that says both things, so it just depends on who you believe. But I think what we try to do is just maintain a soy-free ration for all of our animals. So pigs, the pigs are supplemented as well with a grain feed, but they're out there rooting and eating grass and grubs and stuff like that as well, and that is also soy-free. And it's been really important to Molly, just being a traditional food chef and someone who experienced some real serious allergies to soy, to make sure that our whole farm is free of soy within all the animal feed.
By the way, in terms of poultry, there is a movement afoot now to either free range, or they certainly try to expand the space and the roaming space for chickens in these chicken coops, although there's a lot of controversy about the huge chicken farms that are now coming up that are very, very large. What do you make of that shift, or that discussion that's going on inside the poultry industry there?
I mean, you're asking a regenerative farmer what he thinks. I mean, I personally wouldn't eat that food. But, I also don't want to sit here and point fingers at other farming methods, because, it ultimately makes it sound like we're to blame the farmer. And the reality in all of this is that the consumer, and I'm a consumer as well, has supported the development and evolution of cheaply grown food. And only now are we realizing the ecological cost of that food as well as the health cost of that food. So it's a decision that the consumer has to make, even regarding the humane treatment of animals, which obviously is something that we take very seriously in the way that we raise animals. So I think humane treatment, ecological impact, and personal health impact are really three factors that need to be considered when you're buying food that's inexpensive. And I'm obviously someone who would not be into the idea of giving animals hormones or even using antibiotics as a way to actually make animals grow bigger, which they do, and it's becoming increasingly more illegal and viewed as, in some states as something that I think they're even creating regulations against. So I would be for educating the consumer on what they're eating and how it's grown, and hopefully they will make the decision that will affect change, that will bring about the right type of farming methods that ultimately will provide an opportunity for all of our future generations to be able to eat from the land that we're so lucky to be able to eat from.
Apparently you use bees that are sort of rescued from hives. Tell me a little bit about that decision to go ahead and try to rescue them, and how successful has that been?
Yeah, so we have a working relationship with a few beekeepers down in Los Angeles, and as they find hives in people's fences or attics, we'll take those hives, put them in a box up at the farm. But in the last few years, it's been pretty crazy because we've brought to life this habitat around the farm. We now have swarms that are coming to the farm and landing in a tree, and so we're now finding that the bees are coming to us. Which is cool. It's one of the things that actually happens in the film. And so over the years, we've probably needed to purchase less and less hives from this, from our beekeepers down there in Los Angeles, because the bees, like I say, are landing in the trees. And so we'll just grab the swarm out of that and box it up and put them to work for us on the farm.
By the way, what's been the reaction to all of these efforts that you've put in terms of your farming neighbors, other folks who are into farming? What do they have to say about it all?
In the beginning, of course, they were not very supportive. They would they'd tell us that we couldn't feed the world with this way of farming, which the response to that is that we had never planned on feeding the world, just planned on feeding our community, and that's good enough. And that they thought it was more of a hobby farm and things like that. And so, but we weren't trying to change them, but I think the idea of us being there was threatening because they were worried that we might be pointing fingers at them. And after 8 years now, they've started coming around and asking us questions, and it's been a really wonderful exchange. And we've even got a couple of neighbors to the south that are growing cover crops within the orchards. So it's been really incredible, and it's taken some time for us to earn their respect. But again, I think the law of attraction. You change more people by being an example. And to be honest, we didn't know if it was going to work either. So in fairness to them, it was probably healthy for them to sit by and wait.
Now, you've written a children's book, in addition, obviously, to the film that was made. What motivated you to write a children's book?
Well, I'd been doing these short films for Super Soul Sunday and Oprah series for a number of years while I was on the farm, and they would be these short films about what I would look at as like these characters on the farm, like a chicken named Poodle-Roo, the pig named Emma, and they were all real life characters. And I started sort of telling these little short 5-minute videos that were running on the Super Soul Sunday series, and I was approached by an agent who's a illustrated children's book agent, and asked if I'd be interested in this, and it's something I'd always thought of, and so I jumped on the opportunity. It's a 3 or 6 book series. First one is The Biggest Little Farm, Saving Emma the Pig, and then the next one will probably be about the orphan lamb, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's been really cool to be able to share all these stories in different ways with people who are really interested in this way of farming.
By the way, how did you like the illustrations? I mean, there's one, by the way, that caught my eye, which was I think it was when you had all the piglets. I think either I guess in a house or whatever, and in the background, I think I see you with your hands over your face.
Yeah. Well, this whole experience has been it has tested our our resolve and dedication to this way of life. It's not easy, but incredibly fruitful.
So now you're going to be on the Eastern Shore. Tell me a little bit about what you're going to be doing here.
So I'm going to be there for a book signing, Berlin on Saturday. I'm also going to be there. The film is going to open in the film has been out in theaters since May, but it's going to be opening in the flagship cinema in West Ocean City, I believe, on the 20th, and I'm going to be there on Saturday, the 23rd. Sorry, Saturday the 21st for the 6:30 p.m. showing to do a Q&A, and then again on Tuesday for the 6:30 p.m. showing to do a Q&A with my wife, Molly. So really excited to be bringing the film home to my hometown.
Is you going to enjoy the Eastern Shore again?
Yes, visit family and remember what it's like to feel moisture.
I hear you. Well, we've been speaking with John Chester. He's author of The Biggest Little Farm, Saving Emma the Pig, a children's book, also illustrated by Jennifer Meyer, also with a documentary as well. And we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us this morning.
Well, thanks so much for the interest in the film and the book. I really appreciate you guys.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.